His name was Karl. He worked in the accounting department of a textile firm on Friedrichstrasse in the centre of Berlin. He was 26 years old. He had a desk, a pen set, and a wife named Anna who had packed him a lunch of black bread and cold sausage every morning since the day they were married. He was not rich. He was not poor. He was the thing that Germany had spent 2 centuries building. A careful, educated man with a job and a savings book and a plan. In January of 1923, Karl's savings book showed 800 marks. That was not a fortune, but it was something. A cushion. The kind of thing his father had told him to build. It represented 2 years of putting aside whatever was left after rent, after food, after the tram. He kept the book in the drawer of his nightstand, next to his watch. By November of that same year, 10 months later, those 800 marks were not enough to buy a single postage stamp. This is the story of that year. It did not start with a bang. That is the first thing to understand. 1923 did not arrive as a disaster. It arrived as something more insidious. It arrived as a number problem. The kind of number problem that a man in an accounting department should, in theory, be equipped to understand. The mark had been losing value since the war. Karl knew this. Everyone knew this. Bread that cost a quarter of a mark in 1918 had climbed to 3 marks by 1922. That was annoying. That was something you talked about with your wife at the kitchen table and then adjusted to. You asked for a raise. Your employer gave you something close to it. Life continued. What Karl could not know, what no one in Berlin fully grasped until it was already upon them, was that the number problem was about to leave the realm of arithmetic and enter the realm of hallucination. In January of 1923, French and Belgian troops marched into the Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial heartland, to seize coal and steel that Berlin had failed to deliver as reparations payments. The German government's response was to tell the workers to put down their tools, do nothing, help the occupiers with nothing. The state would pay your wages. The state would print whatever it needed to pay them. For Karl, sitting at his desk on Friedrichstrasse, this was distant news. A political crisis in a region he had never visited. What it meant for the money in his nightstand drawer, he would not understand that until the spring. By March, the bakery near his apartment building had started writing prices on a chalkboard instead of printing them on tags. Karl noticed this but did not think much of it. By May, the chalkboard was being updated twice a day. By June, Anna had started going to the market first thing in the morning before Karl left for work, because the price of a head of cabbage at noon was higher than it had been at 8. She did not panic. She adapted. That was what you did. What began to shift, slowly, then suddenly, was the relationship between time and money. For Karl's entire life, money had been a thing you could store. You earned it, you saved it, you came back to it later, and it was still there. The number on the savings book was a fixed point. It waited for you. In the summer of 1923, that fixed point began to move. Karl's employer, a practical man, not a cruel one, began paying wages twice a day. Morning wages before lunch, afternoon wages before the tram home. This was not generosity. It was necessity. A wage paid on Friday morning was worth meaningfully less by Friday afternoon. By Monday, it was substantially diminished. By the following Friday, it was nearly worthless. The only protection was to spend the money the moment you received it. So Karl began to run. Every mid-morning, when the first wage payment arrived, he left his desk, went to the window where the cashier sat, took his bag of paper marks, and walked as fast as he could to the nearest shop. He was not alone. The street filled with men and women in office clothes, moving with the controlled urgency of people who know that every minute costs them something. A journalist in Berlin named Friedrich Kroner wrote about it in August. He described the shopping lines as looking like a contagion. Women with their kitchen dresses still on, patient faces, moving slowly forward. The city, he wrote, was being shopped empty again. Karl bought whatever he could carry. Rice when there was rice, noodles when there were noodles, soap, candles, anything that would hold its physical value when the paper marks were gone. Anna was already at home, managing the same calculation from the other side. Here is what it felt like from inside. You woke up knowing that the number in your head, the price of bread from yesterday, was no longer true. You did not know what the new number was. You would find out when you got to the shop. And when you got to the shop, the man behind the counter would tell you a number that seemed impossible, and you would count out your marks and you would pay it, because the alternative was not eating. Victor Klemperer, a scholar who kept a diary through these years, wrote in October of 1923 that Germany was collapsing in what he called an eerie, step-by-step manner. He wrote that the dollar stood at 800 million marks and was climbing 300 million higher every day. Then he wrote, "All of this has an immediate impact on one's own life. How long will we still have something to eat? Where will we next have to tighten our belts?" That is what it felt like. Not catastrophe, not chaos. A persistent, grinding arithmetic that demanded your attention every hour and told you, quietly but firmly, that the world you had been promised, the world where a careful man with a job and a savings book and a plan could live a decent life, was no longer available. Karl's employer gave him a raise in July. It was the second raise that year. It was, by any pre-war measure, an enormous raise. And it bought less than the January wage had bought in January. The textile firm kept an accountant specifically to track the exchange rate against the dollar, hour by hour, so that invoices could be issued and prices set in real time. This was now a job. A human being sat at a desk and watched the number change and wrote it down. Karl understood what this man's job meant. He was the proof that the firm no longer trusted the currency to hold its value for even a single hour. The artist George Gross described shopping in those months. He wrote that lingering at a shop window had become a luxury because shopping had to be done immediately. Even an additional minute meant an increase in price. A rabbit might cost 2 million marks more by the time you walked into the store from the street. He used a knapsack to carry his money, because the packages of marks needed to buy the smallest item had long since become too heavy for trouser pockets. Karl did not have a knapsack. He had a cloth bag that had once held his lunch. By September, it was full of paper money every morning, and he walked to the shops with it, and he handed over enormous quantities of it, and the change, if there was change, was often not worth taking. Sometimes the money ran out before the queue moved far enough forward. Then you went home with whatever you had managed to buy, and you made do. The pension is where you see it most clearly. Karl's neighbour in the apartment building was a man named Heinrich, a retired civil servant in his late 60s. He had worked for the city for 30 years. He had a pension. That pension was a number, fixed in the contract he had signed when he retired, paid monthly by the municipality. In 1918, that monthly payment was enough to live on comfortably. By 1921, it was enough to live on if you were careful. By the summer of 1923, it was not enough to last the week. Heinrich was not reckless. He was not foolish. He had done everything a responsible German of his generation was supposed to do. He had served. He had saved. He had retired with a government guarantee. The guarantee was a piece of paper specifying a number, and the number had become meaningless. Karl and Anna began leaving food on Heinrich's doorstep. A little rice, some bread when they could spare it. Not because they had so much, they did not, but because the alternative was watching a man in his late 60s go hungry in the same building where they slept. The pension that was supposed to protect him was protecting nothing. This is what the inflation of 1923 actually did. It did not destroy random people. It destroyed people who had trusted the state's promises. The workers, the savers, the pensioners, the civil servants. The entire class of Germans who had done everything correctly, who had believed in the institutions, who had kept their savings books in their nightstand drawers. The mark took everything they had stored up and reduced it to a number that meant nothing. The barter economy arrived without announcement. One day Karl noticed that the tobacconist on his street had stopped pricing cigarettes in marks at all. He would take a cigarette in exchange for a cigarette. He would take bread. He would take soap. He would not take paper marks except as a last resort, and even then he would calculate the price at the rate of that specific hour, which changed while you were talking to him. Cigarettes have become money, not because anyone declared them money, because they were divisible, portable, and, crucially, because everyone agreed they held value from one day to the next. A cigarette was worth a cigarette tomorrow. A paper mark was not worth a paper mark tomorrow. The sociologist would call this an emergent currency. Karl called it exhausting. He had begun a list which Anna kept in her kitchen. Things that held their value: soap, candles, cigarettes, coffee, coal. Things that did not: everything else. The list was a practical document. It told them what to buy when they had marks in hand and what to stockpile when they had the chance. Bartering required a different skill than buying. You had to know what you had that someone else needed, and you had to find that person, and you had to negotiate in a world where no one agreed what anything was worth. Karl traded a week's supply of soap, carefully accumulated over 3 weeks of strategic buying, for a bag of potatoes that would last them 2 weeks. He felt, afterward, a satisfaction that he had not felt in months. The transaction was real. Both sides got something they needed. No numbers were involved. The shops began closing early, or not opening at all. Merchants who bought goods at morning prices and tried to sell them at morning prices were losing money by afternoon. The only rational response was to close, to wait, to restock at the new prices and open the next day, if you could find the goods at all. By autumn, it was not uncommon to walk down a Berlin street and find iron shutters across every window. Shops that were open posted no prices. You asked the clerk. The clerk told you the number for that hour. If you didn't buy immediately, the number changed. Klemperer wrote about the period of what he called the mad rush of having to shop, the specific quality of anxiety that came from knowing that waiting was always losing. And then, after the stabilization finally came, he described the aftermath as destitution, the inability to buy anything at all, because the rush had used everything. That was the trap the middle class was caught in. You spent your savings trying to survive, and when it was over, the savings were gone. In November of 1923, on the 15th, the Rentenmark arrived. Karl heard about it the way most Berliners did, through the newspapers and through the lines at the savings banks and through conversations on the tram. A new currency, backed not by gold but by the land itself, by mortgages on German farms and factories. 1 Rentenmark equal to 1 trillion paper marks. 12 zeros removed. The wheelbarrow prices, the billion-mark bread, the daily race from the pay window to the shop, all of it ended. Karl stood in the bank the day the exchange opened. He had 2 things in his pocket: the cloth bag of paper marks accumulated over the week, and his savings book. The paper marks were exchangeable. The savings book, the 800 marks he had accumulated over 2 years of careful living, the cushion his father had told him to build, exchanged for a fraction of a single new Rentenmark. He did not make a scene. He thanked the clerk and walked out. Anna was waiting on the corner. He showed her the new note, the Rentenmark, which was the size of a regular note and had numbers on it that were actual numbers, numbers a human being could read without losing count of the zeros. She held it for a moment. Neither of them said anything. They went to the bakery. A loaf of bread cost a fraction of the new mark. The baker wrapped it in paper and handed it over. Karl paid with actual coins, new coins, minted in a week, and he received change. Real change. A smaller coin that would still buy something tomorrow. They walked home with the bread. The nightmare was over. That is what the newspapers said. And in the immediate sense, it was true. The prices stopped racing. The chalkboards went back to printed tags. The morning wage was worth the same amount in the evening. Karl could sit at his desk and do his accounting work without a man at the next desk watching the dollar exchange rate like a hawk. But here is what the stabilization actually meant for Karl and Anna. Their savings, gone. Heinrich's pension, restored, but to a new amount calculated against the new currency, which meant that decades of accrued rights were simply reset. The textile firm Karl worked for, intact. The firm had debt, and the hyperinflation had erased that debt in real terms. The firm had physical assets, looms, fabric, warehouse space, which held their value while the currency dissolved. The firm survived. Karl's savings account did not. This is not incidental to the story. This is the point. The years that followed were what historians call the Golden Twenties, 1924 through 1929. American money poured into Germany under the Dawes Plan. The factories reopened, the restaurants had menus with printed prices that stayed the same all evening. Jazz played in the clubs on the Kurfürstendamm. Berlin became, for a few years, the most alive city in the world. Karl was promoted. He got a raise, a real raise, in stable money. He and Anna moved to a slightly larger apartment. They went to the cinema on Friday evenings. She bought a dress. He bought a book. They did not rebuild their savings, not at the old rate. That particular faith, that the number in the savings book was a fixed point that waited for you, did not fully return. Karl kept a little cash at home. He kept a small amount in a foreign account, through a mechanism a colleague at work had explained to him. He was not a man who had turned against the state. He was a man who had updated his priors. And somewhere in the back of his mind, not as a political opinion, but as a felt knowledge, the kind that lives in the body rather than the brain, was the memory of a November morning when he handed a clerk his savings book and walked out with almost nothing. That memory did not go away in the Golden Twenties. It waited. In 1929, the American loans stopped. The factories began to slow. The unemployment offices opened on Maternity Street, and the lines began to form. A witness who stood in those lines described them years later. The unemployed standing in every kind of weather, waiting for their turn. The misery of years of unemployment having coloured everyone the same shade of grey. Karl kept his job through 1930 and 1931. He was careful. He had learned to be careful in a way that went beyond what his father had taught him. But around him, in the beer halls and on the street corners and in the letters column of the newspaper, he could hear the sound that 800 marks reduced to nothing makes.